Unity of Houston is an inclusive church where we seek to understand and live the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters. At Unity, we welcome all people from all spiritual paths and every walk of life. We celebrate the diversity of our city and of our world, and we teach love, tolerance, and oneness, seeking to live in harmony with open minds and open hearts.
Wherever you are in your spiritual path, you are always welcome at Unity. Join us and discover that the life of your dreams is already within you.
And it's actually the perfect setup. I'm doing a two-part series on the 12 steps for everybody. You don't think you need them? Stick around. You'll need them by the end of today's talk. So today's talk, the joke is a rerun. But then I thought, don't worry about it too much because I know y'all aren't here every Sunday. Some of you are. And then I don't know that you really listen to everything I say. So I ran it by Jean Marie, and she didn't remember it. She said she remembered it, not the punchline. So here we go. An atheist is on vacation in Scotland. And one morning after hiking, he goes out in his kayak on the loch. That's a lake. For those of you who don't know, it's a loch. And suddenly, out of nowhere, the Loch Ness Monster towers out of the water and over him, and without thinking, goes, "God, save me!" And the moment froze with the monster bearing down on his kayak. And then a voice rang from the heavens. She said, "I thought you didn't believe in me." And he said, "Well, 30 seconds ago, I didn't believe in the Loch Ness Monster either, but here we are." Isn't that great? The 12 steps were created in Alcoholics Anonymous in the 1930s by alcoholics who could not stay sober in their whole lives, hopeless alcoholics. And this spiritual path came together really primarily in Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, who was the second person to get sober in AA. And there were 100 men and women who were able to achieve and sustain lasting sobriety and spiritual growth. And they compiled what they had been doing into these steps, and they wrote this book called Alcoholics Anonymous in 1939, I believe. And it has now become just worldwide in so many languages, and not just around alcoholism. It's around family of origin issues, all sorts of chemical addictions, but also with relationships, codependence, so many ways that this spiritual path has helped people, millions of people. And so Father Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan priest, I love I've taught from his books before here, and he wrote a book about the 12-step spirituality intended for everyone. He has the Center for Action and Compassion in Santa Fe, in Albuquerque. And he was at the church one day, and he noticed these alcoholic people were coming out smoking cigarettes after their meetings, and he was really curious about what is that? And so he started talking to these men and women about their program. And they said, "Well, if you like, Father Richard, you can just come to a meeting." Even though some meetings are open and anyone can attend, but most meetings are closed, and you need to have a desire to stop drinking. But they bent the rules for Father Richard. And he came to the meetings, and he began to feel, through people sharing their experience, strength, and hope, the power of the work. And he said that the priests who were doing the Mass upstairs were not being nearly as effective of bringing the good news of Jesus as these simple people sharing their experience and strength and hope with each other. That's where the real spiritual transformation was happening. And so he began to study, and he began to see, he said, "I don't have a chemical addiction, but maybe there's something here." And he finally determined that all of us are addicted. Did you know that? We're all addicted to our own way of thinking. And I know that, thank you, Stephanie, I heard that. And so he wrote this book called Breathing Underwater. And it explores how all of us can gain the benefit of this simple path of spiritual recovery and healing. So I've been thinking about how I'm going to do this in 2 weeks. I could spend easily a month on each of the 12 steps. I could spend a year teaching just what I know and how this has impacted my life. But I'm going to do it in 2 weeks. We'll see. Today I'm going to cover the first 3 steps. And next week I want to talk about some of the practices that we can begin to apply these principles in our life. It's so similar to unity in a lot of ways. You know, all spiritual traditions are based upon universal truths. And they're given different costumes and names and different ways of approaching them. Our founders, Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, they studied all the world religions, and they pulled out what's called the perennial truth, the golden thread, the similarities that's taught in Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And there was some of that in the beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous, too. I want to read to you from the first chapter of Breathing Underwater by Father Richard. I must be upfront with you. Actually, before I do that, I need to read you the first step. We admitted that we were powerless over alcohol or our own thinking or any persons, places, and things, and that our lives had become unmanageable. And so this is what Father Richard says. I must be upfront with you. I do not really understand why God created the world this way. Perhaps the divine is playing games with us. God seems to have hidden holiness and wholeness in a secret place where only the humble will ever find it. Why such a disguise? Why such a game of hide and seek? All I know is that it matches my own observation. I cannot pretend to understand God, but this is what I see. People who have moved from one seeming success to another seldom understand success at all, except a very limited version of their own. But people who fail to do something right, by even their own definition of right, are those who often break through to enlightenment and compassion. It's still a mystery to me, and will still be a mystery for you, even if you read this entire book to the end. Here's what he says at the end of this passage. You will not learn to actively draw upon a larger source until your usual resources are depleted and revealed as wanting. In fact, you will not even know there is a larger source until your own sources and resources fail you. We admitted that we were powerless. Is there anything more unlike unity than that statement? We have books, all kinds of books about power. Eric Butterworth, Discover the Power Within You. Charles Fillmore, The 12 Powers of Man. I went back and looked. I have given 39 talks with the word power in the title since I've been senior minister here. We love power. We love spiritual power to create the life of our dreams and our visions and to change our lives, right? So what is this powerless talk you're talking about, Michael? It is the false self that is powerless to bring you in touch with the true spiritual power of your being. And what is the false self? I was telling Jean Marie, I was really kind of struggling with how to talk about this, because in A Course in Miracles, it's the ego. And so when you read A Course in Miracles and it talks about the ego as being that separate part from God, that's right. That's exactly what I'm talking about. But in psychology, we need a healthy ego to navigate this world. So I don't want to demonize the ego. So I want to use the term the false self. What is the false self? It's your error beliefs and thoughts. It's the conditioning that you got from the trauma in your family of origin. It's the cultural beliefs that are wrong. Think about racism. That's just false. There's no truth in that anywhere. And yet you can't tell me that that is not a system that has affected millions and millions of people of all, what's the word I'm looking for? Ethnicity. We've all been harmed by that one. Not in the way that our people of color have. So there's a thing that happens in a child's mind. We begin to react. We begin to, when we are in pain, and this is pre-verbal. This happens before we even have language. We begin to adapt and adopt new ways of being to try and get our needs met. And if the parents are not able to meet all their needs, and believe me, parents, I know nobody ever can. It's too big a job. That's why there's a whole psychological study and a school of thought around the good enough mother and the good enough father. But all of us kind of came into contact with the world, then our needs weren't always met, and so we began to adapt. We've been doing a lot of study here with the Enneagram. It's 9 types of personalities. All of those are adaptations. Now, I do believe we come in as a soul, so I think there are some things. Some of us are more inclined to adapt this way and not that way. Some of us are more inclined to adapt by pulling away. Some of us are more inclined to adapt by being aggressive and confronting. But we all have it. A few years ago, they began to do this study called, I'm going to get it right, so don't wait. Just wait, hold on. Adverse childhood experiences. I knew that was the first word I couldn't remember. You know about this? If you're a psychologist, you definitely know about this. They began to do research that how many adverse childhood experiences has a person had. And they can be things like growing up in poverty, growing up under racism can be an adverse childhood experience, growing up with parents who are stressed out. That is an adverse childhood experience. Growing up in a household with addiction is an adverse childhood experience. Natural disasters. And the more you have, the more the false self has been built around who you are as a way to get through this world, to keep yourself safe. I was listening to some lectures by Dr. Gabor Mate, who I'm just really being fed by his work right now. But he talked about this from the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences research, that if a person has 6 ACEs, they are far more likely to become chemically dependent. And he said you would think it's probably like 6 times as likely as the general population, but that's not true. 46 times as likely to become addicted if you've had 6 adverse childhood experiences. So all of us have had some of it. And the work that we do in therapy, the work we do here at Unity in healing our error thoughts and false beliefs and coming into the spiritual truth of who we are, all of this is it's the way that we begin to set aside that part of us that did its best to save us, you know? It really tried to. It really tried to find a way through this world without spiritual truth. And at some point, we can come to the end of that resource. All that we know how, the only way I know how to get through this, and it didn't get me very far. And that's when the door begins to open for the next 2 steps. But before I get there, I want to talk about a little bit about my own experience about this, about my false self. I grew up in a pretty good enough father, good enough mother. I believe my parents did a good enough job. I always knew I was loved, and I always knew that I was safe. But there were problems there too. The religion I grew up in, I shared last week at Easter, the abusive nature of that brand of fundamentalist Christianity, I got some of that. I knew I was different from a young age, and I knew that I better shape up. I better man up. And so I began to put on my own false self. I began to find that when I performed, people loved me. So I found my worth and my value in getting on stage and doing something good. My false self was pretty thick. In my late teens, I was 19 when I began to tell the truth about my sexual orientation, and that was not welcome in a fundamentalist Christian culture. So at the time I was a youth pastor at a little Methodist church in Claremore, Oklahoma, and I told the pastor what was going on with me, and we both agreed that I needed to resign. And then my parents, well, believe me, in that time, in that culture, that was the right thing to do. And then my parents were like, why did you quit your church job? You need to come home, we need to have a talk. So I came home and we had a talk, and it was tough. And they didn't have a context for how I could be okay if I were gay. I didn't have a context for it. But that false self began to unravel a little bit, but I didn't have the tools yet. My mother gave me a little marble plaque at that time with a scripture verse on it from 2 Corinthians 12. It says, my strength is made perfect in weakness. I don't know if you know this passage, but Paul is talking about he had a problem, a thorn in the flesh, that's where that phrase comes from, and he asked God, please take it away. Take this away from me, please. 3 times he said he asked, and God did not take it away. Instead, God said this, my grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. So my mom gave me this little plaque that said, my strength is made perfect in weakness, and I hated it. I thought she was telling me that my being gay was a weakness. There was something wrong with me. And I was trying my best to find some authentic way to stand, and I thought I hated it. I put it away. I gave it away at some point. I looked for it this morning. I no longer have it. But what I really I wasn't ready to be powerless yet. And not around that. But because I didn't have the tools to come into my wholeness, I began to adapt with a bottle of vodka. And after the next 9 years or so, I found myself in a recovery program where I could finally admit that I am powerless. A few years after, and that was the beginning, really, of my healing path. I found the new thought, it found me in a bar. I've told you that story before. I found new thought, and I found recovery at the same year when I was 28. So I haven't done either of them perfectly. A few years later, I decided I wanted a tattoo. And I had all these images I'd researched and this and that, because, things that were spiritually significant to me, and thought, no, it's not a picture. I think it's words. What's the message that I would like to have on my body that I would need to remember every day the rest of my life? My strength is made perfect in weakness. This is step one. That's what that is. I get it now. Thanks, Mom. I get it. That I don't have the resources to create the life of my dreams by my false self. Now let's talk about the true self. And this is where there's a little bit of a difference of emphasis, at least, between unity and 12 steps. And let's go to step 2. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Now it's that greater than ourselves piece. Because what we teach in unity is, yes, indeed, there is a power greater than we are, but it's also what we are. It's our true self, is an expression of God's self. And so, in our work in dismantling the false self, the next thing that we have to do is come to believe that I can't make this world safe for me, but something can. A spiritual power will know how to get me through this. So the quality that's in step 2 is faith. Faith. I don't know how it's going to work, but I'm going to just step into it and trust that something will happen. I can't prove to you today that there is a power greater than ourselves, but I have been living as though it were true for a long time. And time again, my experience shows me that it's true. I could not stop drinking. And I tried. I could not. But I found access by my willingness to believe that a power greater than me could restore me to sanity. And that takes us to step 3. Did I get everything in there on that one? Yeah. So I do want to say quickly about the word God. I know some people here, particularly some of our young adults, are not crazy about that word because it's so closely associated with some of those old abusive religious traditions. And I hear you, and I promise to try to use more synonyms. Spirit is a great one. Universe, we could say universe, but now we know we live in a multiverse. So I don't know if universe is quite it, but we know that there is, and here's the thing, there is no word big enough. There's no word big enough to describe God. So I call it God because it's the biggest word I know. That's where I got that from Reverend Michael Dowd. And somebody else said that God is like the blanket we throw over the mystery so we have something to point at. But God is mystery. We'll never be able to hold it in a box. It's infinite. It has no edges. So why would I trust something I can't understand with my very life? Because it's all I got. I tried everything I knew. I will tell you, I love the words in the first 2 steps. Powerless, unmanageable, insanity. That was my life. Thank you, amen. That I could not do it. Without a spiritual foundation, my life did not work. It was chaos. And I don't know where your unmanageability and powerlessness and your insanity is, but I know you got a little bit at least a little bit. There's got to be some pattern where your adaptive false self has been trying to make it work that way for 70 years, and it's still not working, but you're going to keep trying. I know that. That's human. That's just natural to all humans. And if we can just finally admit the truth in step 1, it ain't working. It just ain't working. Maybe there is another way. Maybe there is a spiritual way. Maybe there is something greater than me that I can trust to restore me to sanity and stop doing it my way. Which leads us to step 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to God as we understood God. That makes no sense. My life is already hanging by a thread. Why would I turn it all over to something I can't see and don't understand? It says the God of our own understanding, but my friend used to say the God of my misunderstanding. I came into both New Thought and into recovery with such a limited and angry God. That God did not like me much. Loved me if I did it right. So do you know what I was told in recovery? It was like, you need to fire that God and get a bigger one. That felt like blasphemy, but it was right. I needed to find a bigger concept of the divine. And no concept is complete. But again, because I was willing to the best of my ability, just stop digging a hole. That's how you get to the bottom. You just stop digging a hole. And then to accept the possibility that there might be something larger than me that created the galaxies, that created the universe, that sustains all of life. Maybe I have access to that, and maybe I can turn my will and the care of my life over to that and see what happens. And again, I grew up in a faith-filled family, so I was used to people living their lives based on faith. Now, there were some difference of opinion about different theological concepts, let me just say that. My brother's a Pentecostal pastor, and he's preaching a very different sermon today. I'll tell you that. But I love him. But I began to just live as if there is a spiritual reality that has my back, that will catch me. And so this idea of surrender was something I was willing to give a try. And I made a decision. See, in this we begin to move from the concepts of powerlessness and faith to the action. I made a decision that I'm just going to turn it over. There's a practice that I first heard about it in the recovery world, but I know other people do it, called the God box. Do you know about this? If there's something that you can't figure out in your life and it's causing you pain, write it on a piece of paper and put it in a box that's called God box and leave it the heck alone. I almost said a bad word. I can't believe I caught myself. I'm so glad I did. Leave it alone and see what happens. See, our meddling, egoic, separate self mind will just keep trying to figure, and you're not going to figure it out. Put it in the box. Surrender it. Let it go. There's a story of the beggar and the king. The king proclaimed it had been a beautiful year of harvest, and he wanted to have a wonderful, sumptuous banquet for all the kingdom. And the beggar who stood outside the palace walls saw the proclamation on the wall, and it said, "This is open to anyone who has royal clothes to wear." And he said, "Oh, I can't come. Once again, I'm left out. All I have are these ragged old clothes. What can I do?" And he turned away in despair, and then a strange thought came to him. What if I asked the king? What if I just went up to the palace, asked to talk to the king, and asked him to give me some royal clothes? What if? And he did just that. Before he lost his courage, he was nervous as heck. He walks up to the guard and says, "I would like to speak to the king." The guard says, "Wait here." Came back out and said, "The king would like to speak with you." And he's ushered into the throne room of the king. And it's just beyond glamorous and marvelous. And he's feeling so insecure about his grubby, dirty appearance. But he thought, I'm here. I've got to go through with this. And he said, "Your Majesty, I want to attend your banquet. But you see, these are all the clothes I have, and I can't. Would you be willing to give me some of your cast-off clothing so I can attend?" And the king was moved by his humility and his willingness, his courage. And he called the prince forward, and he said, take this man to your bedchambers and give him something from your wardrobe that he may come to our banquet dressed finely. And he did. And the prince they didn't give him one of the old ones, one of his finest robes, and he placed it upon him. And as the beggar was seeing himself in these beautiful, beautiful clothes, the prince said, and here's the thing. These clothes are imbued with a spiritual quality. They will never fray. They will never wear out. These are all you ever need to wear from this moment forward. And the beggar began to get a sense of who he really was, who he could be if he were wearing these clothes. And he's about to leave, and then he notices that his bundle of rags was still there. And he said, but what if he's wrong? What if the prince doesn't know? And then these begin to wear out, and I have nothing. And so he bundled up his rags, and he walked out. He didn't know where to put his rags. He didn't have a place to keep them safe, so he brought them to the banquet. He put them on his lap. And as the food was going by, and it was incredible, he missed so much of it because his bundle of rags kept falling off his lap, and he missed so much of the experience. And then later he returned to his life, and he never let go of that bundle of rags. And he became known as the man with the beautiful robe who carried the rags. And he missed so much of his life because of holding on to that bundle. As he was dying, the word got to the king what had happened, who this man was, and that he was dying. And he came into his bedroom where he was being cared for. And the beggar told him his sorrow at not being able to let go of this bundle of rags. And they wept together. I have done that. Here's the secret. I'm still doing that. In certain areas, I'm still holding on to my way. I'm still refusing to see any way but my perspective and my way of looking at it. And the invitation is here for us today to let it go. To trust that there is something deeper and truer in the world. There is something deeper and truer in you and in me. Will you pray with me now? I surrender. In this moment, I release anything that stands in the way of me and my divinity, of my connection to infinite love and power and peace. In this moment, in my thoughts, in my heart, I unite my consciousness with this truth that God is all there is and I am one with it. And this is the truth of my being, and this is the truth of everyone here, that we are all image bearers of wholeness and holiness. Knowing this truth, I speak my word now, and that we all may begin to live it more fully, more freely. May we be willing to let go of old patterns. May we be willing to let go of old behaviors. May we be willing to let go of thoughts that have held us captive for years. May we discover the truth of the indwelling Christ. May we discover the truth of the possibility of our own lives. May we find freedom. May we live the lives of freedom that we are ordained to live. In this moment, we are willing to surrender and to allow the magnificence of Spirit to flow through us and to us. And we are lifted, and we are healed, and we are whole. Thank you, God. Amen. Just want to give you a little passage from 1 Thessalonians that speaks to what we're talking about today. May the God of peace make you whole and holy. May you be kept safe in body, heart, and mind, and thus ready to enter the presence. God has called you and will not fail you. And if no one has told you today that they love you, I love you. God bless you.
Thank you for watching this message today. I'd like to invite you to join us in person here on campus at Unity of Houston for Sunday morning or Wednesday evening services. If you can't be with us here on our campus, you can still join us live on Facebook or on our website, unityhouston.org, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Central.